welcome to The Access. I'm your host, Hayvi Bouzo. In this episode, we'll be discussing the current state of the Iranian economy, the Iranian regime's threat to increase its uranium stockpile, and the missile attack on the Green Zone in Baghdad. To talk about all of this, we are joined by Nader Uskowi, Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council, and Ali Safavi, member of the Iranian Parliament in exile in the National Council of Resistance of Iran, and the President of Near East Policy Research. Thank you so much both for joining us today. Obviously, the Iranian regime is going to be the topic of our discussion today. A lot of escalation, a lot of things or developments on a daily basis from there. Let's start with the situation inside of Iran. The protest level has basically declined since a few months ago when we saw many protests throughout the country. Why do you think this is happening despite the ongoing, pressure by the administration against the Iranian regime?
Well, I think that, first of all, let's say that the protests have continued. Mm-hmm. A few days ago, you had protests by thousands of Iranian students at Tehran University who were protesting the imposition of new dress code on women. Mm-hmm. And the protesters were chanting death to the dictator and hardliner reformer, the game is now over. Mm-hmm. There were also protests and continued protests, in fact, by defrauded investors in Tehran, in Mashhad, in other parts of Iran, and also in other regions of the country, in Khuzestan and elsewhere. Mm-hmm. Recall that the country was engulfed in a major flood where 28 out of 31 provinces of Iran were affected. Hundreds of villages were destroyed. Thousands of miles of roads, bridges were destroyed by the flooding. And so the people are coming to grips with the extent of disaster and the devastation that they have suffered. Mm-hmm. And of course, the regime in Iran has done nothing to alleviate that situation. Mm-hmm. So in many respects, the situation in Iran now is like embers beneath the fire. Mm-hmm. And that if Iranians get any opportunity, you will see again the kind of protests that we saw back in 2018. I must also add that the activities of the Iranian resistance, the activists of the Mujahideen Khalq are quite busy around the city. Just yesterday, the Revolutionary Court of Tehran sentenced the 4 MEK activists, one of them to death, mm-hmm. and 3 of them to 5 years in prison. Mm-hmm. And the Minister of Intelligence of Iran, Mahmoud Alavi, said that during the Friday prayer congregation that 116 teams affiliated with the MEK have been arrested throughout Iran. And the Director General of the Ministry of Intelligence in East Azerbaijan province, 2 days later, said that some 60 MEK activists had been arrested in that province. Mm-hmm. So clearly, a lot is happening. Naturally, the mainstream media is not reporting much of it, mm-hmm. and the regime itself, of course, tries to conceal it as well.
Exactly. Do you have a comment on that, Nader?
No, I mean, Ali's right. Demonstration is going to continue, mm-hmm. the favor demonstrations. The floods he mentioned disrupted a little bit about that, mm-hmm. The whole tempo of the demonstration going in, because yes. the floods were really devastated Iranian areas in many, many areas. And now is going to actually become a factor in increased demonstrations, mm-hmm. because the government has been amazingly unable to mm-hmm. do much about anything having to do with helping the flood victims and to start reconstruction of the flood areas. Mm-hmm. And that would add to all the problems that the people of Iran face, and that would actually accelerate their opposition to the regime.
To the regime.
Yes.
What about economically? I mean, now we see an unprecedented amount of sanctions against the Iranian regime in history.
It is. This is the toughest sanctions Iran has ever witnessed during these 40 years of the mm-hmm. Islamic Republic, and it shows, because the economy is really in the worst shape that we have seen ever mm-hmm. in these 40 years. The GDP is contracting by 6-7%, and this is just a figure by IMF, which usually they have very rosy glasses.
Yeah.
Look at these things. 6 or 7% in 2019 mm-hmm. is going down. Since Trump walked out of out of JCPOA, this 1 year, the national currency has lost 60%, 60% of its value. Inflation, again, by the estimate of the IMF, is at 40%. And for next year, they're estimating the inflation will become 50%. And above all, and the most important of all, the exports of Iranian oil have reached less than 500,000 barrels a day, considering that Iran needs about 200,000 barrels a day just to keep up the maintenance and the bureaucracy of the oil industry. When it gets to less than 500,000 barrel, you take away 200,000 of that for expenses of bringing the oil out. Doesn't really much remains that Iran can count on. So they are looking at a serious economic crisis.
Then what are the options for the Iranian regime, knowing that there is now, Rouhani was saying, we want to negotiate with the United States, but not now. Not now until when? I mean, how much can they hold off and not try to attempt to reach some type of deal with this administration that doesn't seem to be interested in reaching a deal? I mean, obviously, this amount of pressure is, for some, they consider this as an attempt for regime change.
Well, I think, to be honest, perhaps the question needs to be framed differently. By that I mean the current predicament of the Iranian regime and, of course, the terrible economic situation that we are facing in Iran today is not so much the result of sanctions. It is first and foremost the result of 40 years of mismanagement, ineptitude, and massive corruption on the part of the regime and its official. Remember that the lion's share of the Iranian economy is controlled by the Revolutionary Guards and Khamenei. 90% of Iran's oil and gas and petrochemical exports are controlled by Khamenei and the Revolutionary Guards. And where does the revenue from this go? To Syria, to keep up Bashar al-Assad, to the Houthis in Yemen, to the Hezbollah in Lebanon, although now it seems that Hassan Nasrallah has been passing around the tin can, trying to raise some money because the regime cannot fund them as it was funding them before. Recall that during Ahmadinejad's presidency, Iranian oil revenues were something like $600 billion. Where did that money go? It didn't go to the people. To the people. It didn't improve their lives. 17 million Iranians now sleep hungry every night. Pictures of grave dwellers, pictures of families searching through garbage to find something to eat. It has become commonplace. So obviously, the regime has no solution, and I don't quite frankly think that negotiating with the United States would get it anywhere, because when you negotiate, you have to give up something. And the United States has made it clear. It has put 12 items on the agenda: dismantling the nuclear weapons program, getting rid of their ballistic missile program, stopping their support for terrorism, stopping enrichment, and a whole host of others. And more recently, they've also emphasized the human rights situation. So is the regime willing to give any of these up? Quite frankly, I don't believe so, because if it does, it will be overthrown. It's as simple as that.
Yeah. What do you think,
the question you ask about if these economic pressures, the maximum pressures that the U.S. administration is putting on Iran, would lead to regime change. Definitely, if trends continue like this, it would lead to economic collapse. As I gave you the numbers, already they are facing a severe economic crisis. And now Trump administration is adding more sanctions on different sectors. They started, if you remember, last year with only oil and banking sanctions. Last month, they added the metals, aluminum, all of those that are a major part of the regime's economy outside the oil. Now they're going to add other sectors, including petrochemical exports and including the other exports to the neighboring countries. So if this trend continues, the Iranian economy would be on the verge of collapse. Whenever you have economy on the verge of collapse, it will be easier for the people to push that regime out.
Yes.
So in that sense, yes, it could lead to a regime change, because it will create a condition necessary for the people on the street and demonstrations and all of those things to really push the regime, because it lessens the control of the regime.
But then what are the tools that the regime can use at this point to try to find a solution? What is the solution? Until when can they hold off and say, oh, this is not the right time?
Right.
To
No.
submit.
Very important question. The center of gravity, if you will, of the regime is the IRGC. So IRGC is the force that the regime is going to use as the last resort to keep it in power. The problem with that thinking is that IRGC itself is under economic pressures. As Ali mentioned, IRGC controls about half probably more than half, the Iranian economy. So when the economy is collapsing, so is those sectors that is controlled by the IRGC. So IRGC is losing economic control as much as any other.
And is designated as a terrorist organization.
Yes. Exactly. And now you add FTO designation, terrorist organization, to that, then nobody wants to deal with that organization. So IRGC is extremely weakened economically, and if demonstrations become nationwide again, would be very difficult for them to really manage and control all of those demonstrations. So if IRGC is the center of gravity and itself is falling and itself is crumbling, then the regime doesn't have much of a future left.
Since you mentioned Iraq, I do want to talk about Iraq, because Iraq has now been basically asked by the United States to increase its oil production. We know that there's an influence, a very strong influence of the Iranian regime inside of Iraq. There's the Hashd al-Shaabi and other Shiite extremist militias who are funded, or basically they pledge allegiance to the Ayatollah regime in Tehran. Then what is the role Iraq can play, especially now that there's threats by the Iranians inside of Iraq against American interests, American embassy, the ExxonMobil production facilities in Basra. I mean, this is a very sensitive, but at the same time, very instrumental country to the American policy towards the Iranian regime.
That's for sure. Iraq is facing problems created by its own governments in the past few years. Government after government in Iraq tried to disregard the rising influence of the IRGC Quds Force-led Shia militias, Kataib Hezbollah, Asab al-Haq, group like that. Not only they ignored the rising influence, they created the PMF, the umbrella group for the Shia militias.
Yes.
But then they put Iran's #1 guy in Iraq, Mohandes, Mehdi al-Mohandes, as the operational director of the PMF. And then through PMF, the Iraqi oil money were partly went to some of these Shia militias whose loyalty was not the Iraqi state, but, as you said, to Ayatollah Khamenei and to the IRGC. They were reported directly to actually General Soleimani of Iran's IRGC's Quds Force. So they have created this, and they thought that by giving them credit, they're going to keep these militias silent. But guess what? Now they have these problems because these militias act independent of the Iraqi state because they report to Soleimani.
Yes.
So if Islamic Republic's interest is to start, let's say, attacking U.S. personnel, let's say start attacking, don't want to have anything to do with them, and I think you already are seeing a major split within the Shia movement in Iraq against the Iranian. And there's protests and all of that, and they don't want these pro-Iran Shia militias to have this kind of influence.
And I guess
What do you think,
I
Ali?
think Nader, addressed the issue quite well. If I have anything to add, is that on the political level, even Ayatollah Sistani issued a statement a few days ago, basically saying that Iraq should stay out of any possible conflict between the regime in Tehran and the United States. Even Muqtada Sadr issued a statement yesterday that if there is any conflict that breaks out between the US and the regime in Tehran, Iraq will not be party to it, which means that at least he will not take the side of Iran.
Yes.
So in this sense, even in Iraq, where the regime has been investing for so long and so much, the tide is turning against the Iranian regime.
But how much power does the government of Iraq and the army, the legitimate Iraqi army, have over these very powerful militias that became more powerful during the fight against ISIS in Mosul and other parts of Iraq?
Unfortunately, Iraq has put itself in a very hard position regarding that. Not that the Iraqi army is not capable. The Iraqi army is a very capable army, but is not yet ready, probably, to face the internal forces, because these guys are working within the Ministry of Interior, which is controlled by the Badre and Amiri, which they control the federal police, the security inside Iraq,
by these people.
Right, and then the PMF is part of the armed forces, which includes all of these pro-Iran things. So Iraqi army will be it's very difficult for them to do that. And besides, Iraqi army were trained by the U.S. Military to defend Iraqi sovereignty and Iraqi national borders, not to act as an internal security force.
Yes.
So it would be very difficult for them. However, having said that, I think what Grand Ayatollah Sistani has done, what Muqtada Sadr is doing, is a manifestation that not all the Shias are united. As a matter of fact, not even majority of them are united, because Muqtada Sadr won the last elections. He got more votes than the pro-Iran Shia factions. So that hopefully will put them in a situation that the Iraqi government can actually play a more determined role. I think Iraq has no other choice but to know that their friends is really not Islamic Republic. Islamic Republic is creating havoc, a wrecking of Iraq, their friends in the West and the US.
Would you like to add anything to this?
No, I think he was.
Okay,
perfect.
let's, I wanted to talk about the letter that was sent from the Omani, through the Omani foreign minister to Tehran. Would you have any anticipation on what might this letter have, knowing the escalation between the American military and obviously the Iranian militias and Iranian access in the region?
Well, obviously, I don't know the details of that letter and what the Omanis told the regime in Tehran. But as we all know, Oman was the location where, when during Mahmoud Ahmadinejad's presidency, at the behest of Khamenei, the Iranian regime began negotiating with the Obama administration. So Muscat has been a place where the officials from the regime in Tehran and the American officials have met before. But I think that whatever the Omanis may have said, and again, I don't know what they have said, I think that if one is anticipating any negotiation between the US and the Iranian regime, I think the Americans have made their position very clear. And that is, the regime in Tehran must show the willingness to agree to the 12 points that have been articulated by Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. And if not, then there's no talks, because it seems to me at least that this administration, contrary to the previous administration, knows the tactics and the motives and the nature of this regime a little bit better. So they're not going to be beguiled into some dragged out, fruitless negotiation, because the regime in Tehran knows that the more they can drag this, maybe the result of 2021 elections in the US will be different and maybe they'll get a free pass.
Yes, that's a very important point, that the Iranian regime is hoping to hold off until the next elections. Do you think this is a functioning strategy on behalf of the Iranian regime?
No, it's a losing strategy for them.
Because it's 2 years.
In 2 years is a long, long time for Iran under severe economic and political pressures at home. I'm not sure it can outlast these problems for 2 years. There is no guarantee that President Trump will not be re-elected. He could very well be re-elected. And there's no guarantee if a democratic president comes to power would not follow President Trump's policies, because the times have changed. It's not like that the U.S. for 4 years have followed a certain policy and then suddenly they can revert back to that.
Especially that in 2025, the nuclear deal will be over anyway, so they will have to come up with
2020, you are talking about only about 5 years from that.
Yeah.
If the letter the Omanis gave to Iranians is a message from the U.S., which all indication shows, definitely is not a love letter. It is a letter saying that, guess what? You come to a negotiating table on our terms, or we are going to maximize the pressure much more than you are feeling now. And I think the administration certainly knows that they are not going to accept those terms now. They're hoping for these 2 years. So the end result of that is Iran has put itself, Islamic Republic has put itself in a really losing situation.
I mean, especially that this administration in last September, they were very clear that they don't even want to negotiate with Rouhani. The administration, some officials actually made a comment that they would only want to negotiate with Ayatollah Khamenei because he is the decision maker in this whole equation. They don't believe this moderates versus conservatives.
Yes, that's correct. I remember a couple of weeks ago, Brian Hook was speaking at the CSIS, and he said, I don't look to what Javad Zarif says, I look to what Qasem Soleimani does. So there seems to be some understanding of who pulls the levers of power in Iran, and as such, I don't think you will see a scenario where John Kerry will be duped into believing the Iranian regime promises on the nuclear programs. There's a new administration in town, people who have a much better understanding of the actions and the nature of the regime and its tactics.
What about the threats by the Iranian regime that they're going to be increasing and doubling the uranium production? I mean, doesn't that completely wipes out the whole argument of the countries in the EU who wants to stay in the deal?
Absolutely, and then matter of fact is a testament to President Trump's correct description of JCPOA, that this was only a temporary solution, and as soon as that was before he walked out of JCPOA, a temporary solution, and it's incomplete agreement. And as soon as the sunset clause goes into effect, Iranians are going to restart doing their program. That by their action, they supported what Trump was saying all along. That really this JCPOA is only a band-aid, if you will, and is not going to resolve a nuclear program of Iran. What they are doing now, the quadrupling of their efforts, is exactly what we expected to do, because Iran, from the very beginning, wanted to have the capability to build a nuclear weapon. And now, with quadrupling that, they're going to go that route again, because they think if they have a nuclear weapon, then they can save the regime towards that. Is going to be the EU is going to be left in the cold of saying that no, JCPOA is going to stop Iranian nuclear program. What Salehi says that he's going to go 20% enrichment within 4 days, and what they have done in the last few days shows that they're really serious about their nuclear program.
And I think that the recent Iranian actions I don't, at least based upon the public statements made by the big EU3, Germany, Britain, and France, that they're not going to accept that. In fact, they issued a statement, said that the Iranian regime should better abide by the terms of the JCPOA. So clearly, quadrupling their enrichment capability is a violation of the JCPOA, I guess it's item 26. And so in this sense, I think the Europeans will have to basically make a decision. Are they going to allow the regime to violate the terms of the agreement to which they are so committed or not? And I think, quite frankly, that at the end of the day, with the change in the balance of power shifting to the detriment of the regime in Tehran, I think the Europeans are going to side with the winning partner. And they're not going to forego the relations, the tremendous commercial relations with the United States in favor of what they are doing with Iran, given that, as Nader mentioned, the Iranian economy is tanking and there will be much less benefit or windfall from doing any business dealing with Iran to begin with.
We will be right back after a quick commercial break. We are back with our guest for tonight's episode, Nader Uskowi, Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council, and Ali Safavi, member of the Iran's Parliament in Exile in the National Council of Resistance of Iran and the President of Near East Policy Research. I mean, I do want to get to you because you want to talk also about the French side and how you're seeing that change, because you mentioned that earlier before we started recording. But I do want to know, in your opinion, let's assume that the Iranian regime does not follow with his threats and they're still trying to keep the Europeans within the deal. Can Europe actually, or those European countries, give the money that the Iranian regime needs to hold off and not be in complete collapse economically, which is what's keeping the Iranians in the deal so far, is that hope of those European countries giving that back channel of money to the Iranian regime? Is that possible?
I don't think so. The Europeans, governments are powerless on this. European companies have decided not to work in Iran. Europe is not, European countries are not dictatorship. The government cannot tell the, for example, Total of France or Deutsche Bank of Germany or a major British petroleum company to force them to go to work in Iran. They are not going to do that. As Ali has mentioned, those companies, if they are forced to choose between the U.S. and Iran, they are going to take the side of U.S. Not just because of doing business in the U.S. in itself. Most of these major companies, including European companies, get their financing from New York. That's even more important than selling or buying from the U.S. for them. So they're going to lose that financial market, and no responsible company in Europe, or for that reason, even in Iraq or Lebanon, or that are holding on in the hope that some of the secondary and tertiary companies, some of the smaller companies who do not need U.S. financial markets and U.S. trade, they're hoping that they would do some kind of a work. But the problem is Iran doesn't need those companies. Iran needs big investors. Iran needs Totals of the world, not a fifth-rate oil traders in a smaller company. It's not going. It's not, and they know it.
What about the evolution of the European
And I think
position?
also, I mean, you mentioned Instex. Even when it comes to Instex, it only deals with commodities that are not under sanctions. So it's not going to resolve anything for the regime. And remember that no cash will be sent to Tehran. The Iranian regime will get the products, and then it would, the money would be going through banks, I guess, were based in Paris. And so it's like an oil for food situation, which will not have any bearing whatsoever on the improving the state of the Iranian economy. And so in this sense, Instex is nothing. It really doesn't offer much to the regime. And especially, again, I emphasize, with the sanctions being put in place, with more sanctions coming, of course, as you may know, the Iranian resistance has urged the US administration to also impose sanctions on the gas and petrochemical industry. If they take that next step, then Khamenei and the IRGC will be grasping for air because there will be just not enough money for them to do anything. So it's a losing investment when it comes to the Europeans.
So now, how long do you think those European countries can hold off before saying, you know what, after the threats, after the seriousness of the American administration, that this deal is done?
I think we are already looking at the convergence of interests between US and major European countries. Britain is a good example. The foreign minister of Britain yesterday gave a very stern warning to Iranians that do not take US administration's threats lightly. The minister of Economy talked about what they're not in a position to actually do work with Iran because of the sanctions. When you go to Europe, and I was in continent last week, you get a feeling within the political and military circles that the position both on the military side and on the political side is becoming much closer to the U.S. administration's position, and the government of Iran knows that because they show you have to be real. Nobody is going to help you with these kind of sanctions in place. Not Europeans, not definitely U.S., not even their friends. Banks, I heard in Lebanon and in Iraq, the chairmen of major banks are saying that they are not going to deal with Iranian banks, even though the government is telling them that they should continue, but they're not going to do that. No serious banker wants to get a blame of working with a terrorist entity, like parts of the banks are controlled by the IRGC.
I do want to ask you, Ali. I mean, now we heard that Iran basically is saying that they are on the verge of getting the nuclear weapon, that they're so close, they have all the materials they need. I mean, this is a full-on threat of basically that we don't need anybody's help to get this nuclear weapon. And if the JCPOA is gone, then are we really going to be seeing a nuclear Iran?
Remember that when there was discussion by the Trump administration that they're going to withdraw from the JCPOA, Khamenei said publicly that if the US walks out, I will burn the JCPOA myself. It seems that he's still waiting to find a lighter to do that. You have to understand the psychology of the regime in Tehran. They only respond to a language of firmness and decisiveness. They bully people around into submission, into concession. I think if the international community maintains a united, a decisive posture, the Iranian regime will not do anything. Recall that they have been taking it on the chin in Syria, with hundreds of revolutionary guards and their proxy forces being killed systematically over the past few months as a result of airstrikes and things like that from a neighboring country. And the regime has done nothing whatsoever in reaction and in retaliation. They haven't even brought back their dead to bury them in Tehran or in Iran because of the public backlash that would create. So I don't think the people outside of Iran should read much into the threats of the regime in Tehran. Even this discussion that if anything happens, the regime is going to do this, is going to do that, that is all part of the regime's hollow show of force to show that it's still in power, that is in a strong position. The fact is that the ground now is shaking underneath the mullahs. Domestically, they are facing an increasingly enraged population that they know are going to erupt very soon. Regionally, they are isolated. We have a strong Arab coalition against them. And internationally, the position of the United States is very clear. So I do not believe that the international community should fear the propaganda coming out of Iran. It's like a man whistling past the graveyard. That's the situation of the Iranian regime, in my estimation.
What do you think, Nader, about the nuclear
Iran's nuclear
capabilities?
program is a very serious threat to the region and to the whole world, really. If Iran wants to go full force to build a nuclear weapon, that's a red line that that's not going to be accepted, not only by Trump administration, but by entire U.S. Political circles, including Democratic Party.
Okay.
Democratic parties, none of the Democratic parties, although they said JCPOA, they are in favor of JCPOA, none of them are in favor of Iran working on a nuclear. The whole deal, they are in favor of JCPOA because they think JCPOA prevents Iran from building the bomb.
Yes.
So definitely a program building go on that route. The administration will stop Iran militarily. They have said that already.
So militarily is
and
the
the
option.
U.S. military, that's the only option when you go that far. And U.S. Central Command, CENTCOM, is ready for it. It's not that they're going to get surprised of what happened. They would follow it, and they would follow not just not just nuclear programs that Iran had that stopped working within the JCPOA, but Iran has other nuclear programs probably all over the country.
Yes.
That the U.S. is very much aware of that, and if they
will
know
bomb all of them.
Well, I don't know how they're going to do it, but I'm very sure the Central Command CENTCOM would be ready for it, and is ready for it.
And is ready for
and
it
is ready
now
to, yes.
to do it. Let's go back to the elephant in the room, which is the recent attacks by Iranian. I mean, now this is the speculation that there were Iranian militias targeting American interest in the stability of the Hormuz, including what they did in UAE port area, Fujairah, and obviously later on the Houthis attacked sites within Saudi Arabia where they have oil production. In your opinion, the American response to that, did it send a clear message to the Iranian regime? And what else could the United States do at this point if we saw another type of escalation by the Iranian regime, or do you think they already got the message?
Well, I think that the administration has made its position very clear that if the Iranian regime attacks U.S. interests or interests of its allies in the region, that the United States will react appropriately and decisively. Now, I guess looking from the outside of this administration, I think that the U.S. is very serious about that. And even after the recent incidents, including the firing of a rocket that fell near the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad, again, the U.S. government made a public statement that we will not tolerate such actions. So one would expect, if in fact the regime engages in similar activities in the region, whether it's against the U.S. interest or against some of the allies of the United States, that the United States would deliver on its promise. And as to what that will be, I don't know. Maybe Nader would have better insight into this than I, but that's what I think.
What do you think, Nader? I mean, what could the United States do, knowing that there are some opposition to the president within the United States? I mean, some media outlets were basically more pro the Iranian regime than the American administration.
If the Islamic Republic starts or act hostile towards U.S. personnel, U.S. facilities, diplomatic posts in the region. The opposition to Trump administration and dealing in Iran will disappear. The whole political establishment in this country, including majority of the Democratic Party, will unite behind the president to defend the interest of the U.S. in the region, to defend the U.S. personnel in the region, to defend our diplomatic post in the region. So if there would be a major attack, either by Iran or by their proxies, on any of these major installations, like said the embassy in Baghdad, let's say a ship, a U.S. ship on Bab al-Mandab attacked by the Houthis, or in Persian Gulf, for that matter, any major attack would be seen as an attack on the U.S. As a whole, and again, I think the U.S. Central Command and the CENTCOM is ready for that. By the way, CENTCOM have B-52s, they have F-35s. These are the stealth fighters. So they have amassed a huge armada around Iran. And if such an attack comes to a major attack on U.S. interest, then you're going to see immediately you're going to see a start of conflict, direct conflict between U.S. and Iran.
What do you think of the Russian position on all of this development? Because Russia has been always very close to the Iranian regime. They do have relationships with other countries in the region as well, but Iran is its major ally so far.
I think that, again, I think if history is a judge, I think that the Russian government is first and foremost after its own interests than the interest of any government. Remember that the Soviet Union had strategic ties with the former government of Iraq. It basically trained its entire army, provided with all of the armor, ammunition, missile systems, everything. But when push came to shove, and it was quite clear that there would be an internationally mandated attack against Iraq in 1990, the Soviet Union did nothing. They remained silent. They didn't even veto the resolution. They abstained, opening the way for the US and the Allied forces attack on Iraq in 1990. So I think fast forward to 2019, if the situation gets escalated to a point where a conflict is likely, I do not believe that the Russians would want to put their eggs in the basket of a regime that they know will not be around that much longer. Having said that, I do not believe that there will be a need for, if you will, a military conflict with the Iranian regime. I think the people of Iran have demonstrated that they want this regime out. The organized opposition is ready and willing and has its network domestically. So I think, or I guess from our perspective, the best policy the United States can pursue is to ratchet up the sanctions against this regime, deny it the lifeline with which it has been able to suppress the people of Iran and foment chaos in the region, and the rest will be done by the Iranian people. And I think some public statement of support for the desire of the people of Iran to overthrow this regime would greatly encourage the people of Iran to come out and do what they have been yearning for so many years, to bring a free and democratic country to Iran.
What do you think, Nader?
Oh, absolutely. Ali explained to you very well about the opposition in Iran. The opposition in Iran does not need U.S. to attack the Islamic Republic militarily. So I'm sure they have, and Ali more than anybody else can represent that. They can. They have plans.
My question was about Russia's. Though.
Oh, Russia. Well, I agree. Russia's President Putin just said the other day that he's not going to be the fireman if a conflict breaks between Iran and U.S. So Russia's not going to do much. yes, Russia wants to have Iran on its side. Yes, Russia wants to sell. Yes, Russia wants to have Iran on its side. Yes, Russia wants to sell Iran their latest airplanes and whatever they can do. But if it comes to the point of conflict between the U.S. and Iran, Russia is not going to take side. And Putin said so in those very terms. He's not going to be the fireman of the Middle East.
I think we have to wait and see. There's a lot happening, and I anticipate that we're going to be talking more about this in the coming days. Thank you so much, both. That was a great discussion.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
That was it for tonight's episode. Thank you for sticking with us. Good night.